Alrighty, to spare myself the embarrassment, I have turned off my cell phone or put it on vibrate, so hopefully you all will do the same or face the wrath of it being ever immortalized in video that your cell phone went off during the presentation. So, hi everyone, thanks for coming to the Boston MySQL meetup group, user group. My name is Shiri Kutzer for those who don't know, and today we're going to be talking about backups, specifically MySQL backups. I am a MySQL DBA. My email address is outfif@gmail.com. I had done a last minute change, which I guess didn't get up there. If you go to shiri.com, you can actually see my blog, and I will post there as well as on the MySQL users group when this video is up to be able to be seen, and the presentation will be up later tonight or tomorrow. First things first, I'm not an expert. I'm a user. I'm not any smarter than you, and I'm not affiliated with the company MySQL AB. Pretty much that means that anything I say may or may not be correct. I have done my research, so hopefully it's all correct. But if you know that you're doing something a certain way and I say it can't be done, feel free to raise your hand, speak up, ask questions. I also don't have the breadth of experience that you guys have, so feel free to say, hey, we did this, this time. Ask questions and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I do have some qualifications though. I did get a master's degree specializing in databases. I am a MySQL DBA as my job function, my job title. I'm course certified in MySQL 4.1, and I have over 5 years experience with production databases of MySQL. Most importantly, I volunteered. Anybody can make a presentation on anything they want. So if you want to present a topic, it doesn't have to be very long. It can be 20 minutes, half an hour. Just contact me and we'll see what we can do. So let's get into the meat of it. I've put this presentation pretty much into the who, what, when, where, why, how kind of format. So we're going to start with why. Why would you take a backup? One of the things you might take a backup for is database migration. Whether you're migrating to a different platform, or you're migrating from a different platform, or you are just moving servers, you want to take a backup because if something fails, you want the backup. Also, to be able to move the data over. That's one way to do it. You might want it for archiving purposes, reporting, if you have a data warehouse, that kind of thing. For analysis and liability, if you've got Sarbanes-Oxley or HIPAA requirements, or the FBI just came into your office saying, hey, we need this now, you may need to take some backups of things. And the one that most people are familiar with is recovery. Just in case something happens, you take a backup. So there are a couple of different things that you can recover. You can recover from data corruption, which is if the data in your current database is bad. It may all be there, but it may not be good. And then there's recovering from data loss. One of the things that you're going to want to figure out is, be realistic about what you can lose in an emergency. Now, be realistic about that internally. When you talk with your boss, or maybe the director of IT, the head honchos say, what really can we lose? When I was working at Tufts, we had a webmail system that had database backend of MySQL. And we talked about it, and we're like, well, what can we lose? Can we lose an hour's worth of data? And this wasn't actually the email that was stored in the database, it was just the profiles. So we said, you know what? In a catastrophic event, we could lose up to, say, 15 minutes of information. We can, go to the community and say, you know what? Between 10 a.m. and 10:15, if you changed your profile, you changed your signature, please do it again. We're sorry, we had a major loss. And a lot of the times too, people don't change their profiles all that often. So a lot of times, if something bad did happen, it was just kind of the last access time maybe was wrong. Of course, you don't want to lose the president's profile. So there are some things you can do about that. So a bank may not want to lose any data. A hospital may not be able to lose any data. But if it's for something that's either not mission critical or mission critical, but your community will understand if there's a catastrophe, it's good to get those things straight right off the bat. So let's get into the who. Ultimately, obviously, the head of the company, or the heads of the company are responsible for it. But the head of IT, what are you going to use? There are going to be people who are kind of secondarily responsible for it, like your backup service and your operators. If they're wrong, if they make a mistake, if they do something, they could, they could obviously mess up your backup so that you don't have them. If they, forget to send a tape off site and, they lose there's a fire on site and they lose the tapes, obviously they're responsible for that. But usually it comes down to the sysadmin and or the DBA. Not everyone has DBAs, so it could be the sysadmin. You want to make sure the duties are clear, because if you say, well, the DBA is going to take a snapshot of the data or do a MySQL dump of the data, but the sysadmin is responsible for the scripts that copy it over to another server. If one of the servers goes down and you lose all the data and it's not copied over, that's not really the DBA's fault, it's kind of the sysadmin's fault. So you want to make sure you are very clear on whose responsibility these things are, and also who should get notified if these things don't work. The DBA is going to want to know if the backups don't work, even if the backups are the jurisdiction of the sysadmin. So you want to make sure you have that absolutely clear, so that you know who to blame when something goes wrong. So what? Do you really need to back all your data up? Do you have static data that you don't want to ever back up? States of the United States, it's easy enough to get that again. Do you need to back up commands? Who accessed what? There's your Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA again. And what are your terms of service? What are the expectations of your users versus what do you actually guarantee? And you also want to make sure that you know where the expectations of the users overcome the terms of service, because there are many times where the terms of service will say one thing, but the expectations are another thing, and the expectations will actually win. When I was at Tufts again, if a dean of schools or the president lost email, we would retrieve it from backup. But our policy was we don't back up email. So if a student called to us saying, oh, I just deleted an email, we would say, I'm sorry, that's it. Obviously, we have things in place for disaster recovery. If our own servers went down, we had to back them up. So you really want to make sure that your terms of service wins 90% of the time, that you have policies, that they're clear, and all that kind of stuff. When do you want to back up your data? You want to do it automatically, no matter what, because you don't want to have to remember to do it. That's the really important thing. If you have static data, we have postal code data. We don't need to be backing that up every night. How often do we change postal code data? If you have my ISIM pack tables that are read-only, you probably aren't changing the data all that much. Don't back things up as frequently during high usage or reporting. If you have a heavy keying cycle at the end of the year, if you have a heavier usage times, like universities will have start of semester, end of semester. We used to have a rule that we never did anything important during finals. We never changed anything on production during finals week or during midterms week, things like that. So you may even want special rules on when you don't back things up. And you can do that with scripts. Don't back it up during the end of the month, or back it up more often because more things are changing. So the other thing about when is that the backing up can cause load. It can cause table locking. So don't do it at your highest usage periods. Where are the backups going to be stored? Are they going to be stored on the database server only? You may want to put it, well, no, you definitely want to put your backups on a different partition than your data. That way, if one of the partition goes, you will still have your backups and your logs. Are you going to copy it to another server? Make sure you remember to do that automatically, otherwise you're not going to remember. Is it going to be another server on-site? Is it going to be another server off-site? Are you going to do it to a colo facility? Or are you backing it up to a tape? And if you're backing it up to a tape, do you take the tape off-site, that kind of thing? And this is exactly why it's important to make the duties clear, because you want to know who's responsible for what. Is the DBA responsible for taking the tape and making sure it gets sent to Iron Mountain? Who knows? The other thing is you can, for copying and things like that, you can have automated scripts to do that. A little note about off-site backups and colos and things like that. Lots of people had colos in places like Houston and New Orleans. That's not such a good idea. It's not the world's worst idea, but don't put all of your servers in one place. Given that we have earthquakes, mudslides, monsoons, wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, blizzards, tornadoes, tsunamis, sandstorms, eruptions, avalanches, lahars, terrorism, extreme heat, and extreme cold, It seems there's no good place to keep information. It's never going to be perfect. So have, you know, 1 or 2 different places. You know, don't put it in the middle of New York City, both your servers. You know, don't have your offsite backup to be across the street, because, you know, if something happens and, you know, the 000 point of all the missiles is Raytheon is just down the street. So if you work here and your data is backed up across the street, if, you know, missiles happen to hit on the 000 point, you know, not a good idea. So if you ended up having one colo server in the World Trade Center and 1 in New Orleans, it's not going to, you know, disasters aren't going to happen that close together. This, by the way, is a lahar. It's a let's see, what is it? I have it written down here. It's a mud flow around volcanic area. It has about the consistency of concrete. Just in case anyone wanted to know what a lahar was, because I did. So now we're going to get into the how. There are 7 different ways that we're going to discuss of how to do it. We're not going to discuss the purely operating system level things like RAID or clustering done by Linux or any kind of, you know, backup that is purely OS level. We are going to talk about the tools that come with MySQL and things that you can do based on the properties of MySQL. So select into out file is a command you can use. MySQL dump, which most people are using. Backup table, which is actually deprecated. Replication, which is certainly a valid form of backing up. You can OS level copy the data files. One of the greatest things about both MyISAM and InnoDB tables is that they are operating system independent, which we'll get to a little bit later. But it means you can copy the files from a Solaris server and use it on a Windows server if you want, which is great. MySQL hot copy, which copies stuff, and InnoDB hot backup, which is MySQL hot copy is a hot copying utility only for MyISAM tables. The InnoDB hot backup is only for InnoDB tables. Out of all of these, InnoDB hot backup is the only one that actually costs money. Everything else comes with MySQL. If you're using backups for recovery, which is usually what people think when they think backups, you really want a snapshot. If you don't use a snapshot, it's going to be really hard to recover because you don't know really where, you don't have a point in time that you can go back to. What you want is you want a snapshot, and then you do the binary logging, which is the data manipulation, all the alter, create, insert, replace statements after you take your snapshot. The only exception to that is replication, which of course is live, real time. You don't need to use the binary logs because that's what well, you need to use it, but it uses it for replication. So replication is kind of immediately available as a backup. So why are there so many options? One of the reasons is that because MySQL grew organically, you just kind of have, you know, one option, and then somebody comes out with another option, and, you know, I forget who made the Perl script for MySQL hot copy, but whoever it was that made it, it was so good they decided to include it in with MySQL. There are different storage architectures, so there are different tools for the different storage architecture. You can also use OS level tools. You could just take a copy of the data files, for instance, for MyISAM. And there are also MySQL client commands. As far as the OS level tools, the MyISAM tables are stored with the lowest byte, with the low byte first, which that's just what it says in the manual, and that's what makes it operating system independent. InnoDB data files are the same. The one caveat about copying the files on the OS level, if you're changing from a Windows server to a Unix server or Unix to Windows, Windows is case insensitive, whereas Unix is not. So that's the only thing you have to worry about when you're changing architectures to or from Windows. So we'll talk about select into out file. It's a MySQL extension to an ANSI standard SQL. Obviously, select is standard SQL. Although I don't know how you can have a standard query language, but there you go. It works with every single storage engine, and it probably will always work with every single storage engine because it's a client command. And it's very flexible. You know, if you don't want to back up half a table, you know, because it never changes, you can do that. If you only want to back up today's data, you can do that because you can use any of the where clauses. It's also the locking on this is whatever the storage engine locking is. So for instance, MyISAM does table level locking. InnoDB does row level locking. So it's also not a snapshot from table to table. And somehow you have to figure out a way to loop through all the tables, because this command will only do it once. So you would, if you use this as your backup strategy, you would want some kind of a script to find all the tables, and then for each table loop through it and do it. And that obviously doesn't do a point in time recovery unless you lock all the tables beforehand. So you have to do separate locking if you want to do that. And it's also constrained by the select. It's very flexible because of the select, but it's also constrained by it. It doesn't get the schema in versions less than 5.0. Obviously in 5.0 and above you have the information schema database, and I haven't played with it, so I don't know, but I don't think it's possible to dump the schema and then re-import the schema into the information schema database. I think that's read-only, so I don't think you can back it up that way. And as I said, you need extra code to get all the tables. You can't just do it from one command. And if you can't do it with select, you can't back it up. MySQL dump. This is pretty much what everyone uses. Most people use it anyway. It's a client interface, just like MySQL, the client, or other, interfaces to it. And it's in wide usage. It's for any storage engine. One of the things about it is that it produces a text file, which makes it a little easier to spot corruption. If you get a text file that's 2K out of MySQL dump, you probably did something wrong, unless your data is 2K. You also have to be very careful because there are lots and lots of options. You can back up one table, you can back up all the tables, you can back up all the tables in a database. There's no way to back up all of the databases. You can do -- all databases actually, so you can do that. There's thorough documentation online, -- quick and -- compatible. -- quick will do it, let's see if I remember this correctly. -- quick goes through and it makes it so that it doesn't have to load every single thing into memory. It'll write to the file as it reads from the database. Otherwise you get it all in memory, and you have to wait until it all gets in memory before it writes to the disk. And if you have a very large database, it may not get into memory and you may end up crashing things. -- compatible, I believe, is an option that you can make it compatible to. Oh, here we go. Look, it's in my notes. Takes a bunch of options as to what it's compatible with. So you can say compatible ANSI, which does ANSI standard SQL. You can say, I want it to be compatible with MySQL 3.23 if you're going to an old database. You can say, I want it to be compatible with Oracle if you're changing over there. I want it to be compatible with no table options, which means don't put any table-specific MySQL options, or don't put any field-specific MySQL options. You want to be careful with that, though. We actually had, in my company, we didn't have the create options flag. So we didn't have it compatible with table options, which meant that our tables, when we did a dump and reloaded it, all the tables were the default table, which are MyISOM, which is not what we wanted. And it also inserted it into the default character set, which was also not what we wanted. We wanted a character set of UTF, not Latin 1. So that was table-specific options. You also have field-specific options like auto-increment, which are pretty important. That's actually a MySQL extension, so other databases don't have that. So you want to be very careful with your options, otherwise you may not get what you think you're getting. Lock tables locks all the tables in the database at once, but it doesn't do it across all databases. It just does it across that one database, whatever you've put to MySQL dump. Single transaction is for transactional tables like InnoDB and BDB, and that will actually be a consistent snapshot of that database, or those tables actually, because you're doing it as a single transaction. So you start the transaction, and anything that's written to the database after that transaction starts won't actually be read by the MySQL dump. So that's a good option to have. If you're doing replication, you want to use the master data option, which will put into your dump file where you are in the master logs. Dash dash opt has most of what you're really going to want. So again, you can go to the documentation, look at that. And you can do, if you don't want everything, you can do dash dash skip opt, or you can use opt with dash dash skip feature. So for instance, let's say for whatever reason you want everything that's in dash dash opt but not quick. You can do dash dash skip dash quick. So let's see. Replication. Replication is really, really great because it eliminates that single point of failure of that one machine. And it's pretty much available immediately. It might be hard to convince management that you need another server because it requires hardware. But again, it's an automatic sync. You can use it for backup. You can use it for high availability. You can use it for reporting. I'm a firm believer that internal things like reporting shouldn't really affect your customers and your users. So if you know that, we know that the head of our company likes to know how much money he's making, so he'll run reports, but he'll do that on the read-only server.
Do you know how dramatically it slows down the master?
Do I know how replication slows down the master? It doesn't really. What it does is it reads from the binary logs on the master. So there aren't really database reads. It's just the data manipulation language in the binary logs. But that's
And network, of course.
And network, of course, yes. And there's obviously reading from the logs. There's a little CPU load, but it's not really. It doesn't really affect the master that much. Yeah.
So the master, let's say the master is 4.0 and the slaves are 5. Does that matter?
That will work as long as you don't have any functions that can be used in 5.1, any statements that are used in 4.1 that aren't used in 5.0. So that will work. What replication does is it just takes the statements that change the database or the data. So your inserts, your replace intos, that kind of thing. If you have a slave that's 5.0, I'm pretty sure, unless there's a command that was deprecated in 4.1, you're fine. Yeah?
So if we use replication and then want to do some sort of further backup on that, we can't just stop replication, copy the files elsewhere, because now we don't know. For those files, we don't know where we are in the master. If you look at your previous slide, you would still have to do a dump because you need to know where you are in the master, right?
Well, so the question is, can you stop replication, because otherwise then you won't know where you are in the master. Actually, the slave server keeps that all in its memory. If your master server crashes and comes back up, replication will start again.
So for the next tier, so these files,
Right.
now I want to back up my slave.
You can back up your slave as
I
well.
can't just copy the file. I can't just do a copy though.
A copy of what?
What you can do is
Of the data directory, because those backed up files, I want to know where I am in the master.
So yeah, you can. This is how we do it at Tufts. Because our database is so heavy loaded that we do replication, and the sole purpose of replication is for backup.
right?
And so what you have to do though is your replication always knows where it is in the master's logs. So as it's reading through the master's logs, it keeps track of that. So when you lock that database to take a backup, you need to note where in the master am I right now, and so the slave will tell you where the master is right now. And
Right.
if you ever need to restore, you're restoring to whatever the time the slave thought it was in the master.
If you're just doing a file copy though,
Yeah.
how do you know that? Can you go back a slide?
Well, you lock the database and then
So
you
don't you need the master data equals 1 to know where you are in the log file?
Correct. However, you can do that with a MySQL dump of the slave. You can say, where am I in the slave logs?
There's
Yeah.
an info file that you back up that
Yep.
contains your master log file position.
It's called master.info.
Okay.
Master.info, and you can also, if you want, you can run a show slave status that'll show you what log file you're in and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, master.info in the, I believe it's in the data directory.
So you just have to, that backs up
Yeah.
as well. Then you're saying.
And that also, you want to be careful with that file because that actually has the replication password in it as well. So, which is great if you ever forget your replication password, but you want to make sure that that's locked, so only people who want access, only people who deserve access to read that kind of password has that kind of password. But it has the username, the password, where you are, in the binary log and which binary log you're in. So yeah, you can definitely do that. And you can start and stop replication, as I was saying, without any problem. So let's see. Yeah, slaves can use different engines. You asked the question, can you use different versions of MySQL? You can also use different engines. Let's say you want to do some data warehousing and you have some EnoDB tables. You know, maybe you're a supermarket and you have lots and lots of transactions coming in, so you want a transactional database like engine like EnoDB. You can use that, and then you can replicate to a MyISAM table. And that'll work just fine, so that you can do your different reporting with a different storage engine. And one master can replicate to many slaves. The one thing about replication that you want to make sure you know is that because it only copies over the commands, there's no real way to know if your slave and your master have the exact same data. Because if someone went on the slave and changed data, you may not know. You may know because it may cause, a duplicate key error.
We learned the hard way that you really should have different passwords so that the slave,
Yep.
the master, so that nobody inadvertently.
That's a great point. Different passwords for the slave and the master. You may want definitely different root passwords. Maybe no users with the ability to write other than root to the slave servers.
There's a configuration option that you can put in your configuration file that says, this is the slave, nobody can write to this, except for the replication process. So if you set that, then replication is the only thing that can actually write.
So there's a feature you can set. Is that only in 5.0 and higher? Is that okay?
5.4.1.
4.1 and higher.
4.1.
I'll actually look that up. Let me write that down to look up later. I'll write that down later. But I'll look that up and see what command that is, because that's very useful. And people have circular masters where you have more than one server which you can write to and they replicate to each other. That's a little dangerous. I'm not comfortable with that. Some people are. One thing there's obviously things that you want to consider. You don't need to lock with replication, which is great. It doesn't do any locking. It's definitely a true snapshot, but you can't recover from corrupt data, and you can't go back to a certain point in time. You have the data that's there now, and that's it. And it requires another MySQL instance, preferably another server.
Unless you do what we talked about, is say every hour in the hour, do another tier of backup.
Right. But replication by itself, right? That would be using MySQL dump. We use all these things so interchangeably that we don't think of them as separate tools, but they really are.
Yeah, I just would like to mention that if you're using it for backup purposes, then you really can get away with very cheap disks because there's a lot less disk traffic. If you only do replication to it, because it's only all the updates and inserts and so on that go to the replicated database. So we actually have a regular desktop holding the slave, and then RAID and all of that.
Right. So just for the benefit of the people who may not be able to hear your voice on the recording, he said that since disk is so cheap and you'll have so few writes and things like that, if you use replication, you can just use a desktop. You don't need a powerful server, things like that. Of course, once you put a new server or something into place, management always finds another use for, now we can do those analyses we always wanted to do. So maybe having it on a desktop is a good idea, because then nobody really knows it's there, and in an emergency you're the hero. So let's see. So yeah, and you can, if you really wanted to, you could replicate to the same server if you wanted. It has to be a different MySQL instance, but if you really wanted to, you could do that. Backup table is deprecated. Use MySQL hot copy. This is really I have to say about that, but I put it in there for completeness. You can copy the files just with CP if you're using some kind of Unix, or with copy if you're using Windows. You're going to want to lock the tables separately. Obviously, the OS doesn't lock the tables for you. You have to use external code to do that. And backup corruption is a little harder to catch, because you can't just kind of glance through a text file and see if it's there. You kind of have to see if it's the same size, and if it's the same size, you may still have some, say, character corruption. But but you can use it for migration because it's operating system independent with the two major field types. Obviously with the memory field type, it's OS independent because it's all in memory. But for MyISAM and InnoDB, which are pretty much the widely used ones, it's
version independent?
and version independent, yes. Although I think 5.0 with InnoDB makes the files a little more compact. I was reading something like that today, that the InnoDB has a more compact.
We tried to go from 5.0 back to 4.1.
Mm-hmm. So you.
Didn't work.
Yeah, InnoDB 5.0 to 4.1 didn't work, but I think 4.1 to 5.0 will work, and then it does work, and then you can actually do some kind of command to, because it does make the table smaller, the InnoDB data files. Let's see. Just remember that Windows is case insensitive and Unix is not. So if you have tables that are case sensitive and your code isn't written case sensitively because it didn't need to because it was on Windows, you're going to have problems. With the OS level copying a file, it's easy to do one table. You can do one database. You can do some tables in a database using, say, regular expressions or awk or sed, whatever you want. You know, some databases, all tables in a database, all databases. So it's very configurable. If you have some static data in one table, you can say back up everything, but copy everything except for this one file. MySQL hot copy is only for MyISAM tables. It's very good, but it's only for MyISAM tables. So if you have a mix of MyISAM and InnoDB, you're going to want this and something else, or just use MySQL dump. It's a Perl script for Unix and NetWare. I haven't actually tested it out on Windows. If you have Perl on Windows, might work, might not. And you can use Perl regular expressions for database and table selection. So if you want everything that starts with Shiri star, you can do that. Any table that starts with Shiri or any table that starts with A, you can do that. And you can do -- dry run, which is nice because it's nice to know what's going to happen before you actually let it loose on your database. There's also compression 1 to 9. No, let me see. That may not be the slide I'm on. InnoDB hot backup. Yeah, this is the one with compression. It's commercial. It's $500 per year per server, or it's $1,300 per server for the lifetime. I've tried it. You can't actually use it on a different server than the one you're using. I didn't try very hard, but you get a compiled binary. So if you have it on, say, a 64-bit system, you can't use it on a 32-bit system. You have to get the right binary for what you do. It doesn't do locking, so you have to do it independently. It doesn't need locks, actually. Excuse me. It doesn't need locks. It's like MySQL hot copy. It copies the data files, and it is a true snapshot. And then you can do something called apply log, which you apply the logs to it to say, okay, apply the logs up to this point in time. So that's actually really, really good. Worth the money.
What's the reason if you have all others, why we need this one?
If you only have MyISAM tables, you don't need it. If you have MyISAM tables and InnoDB tables, the only way to get a true snapshot of your entire database without locking it so that the whole MySQL dump continues is to get this. Because while InnoDB hot backup only does InnoDB tables, there's actually a free script that comes along with it that will say, okay, do the hot backup, but keep the tables locked while I do MySQL hot copy to do another one. So you can actually, with this program, you can actually get a true snapshot of both InnoDB and MyISAM tables. But yeah, if you only have MyISAM tables, use MySQL hot copy. Alternatively, if you have a database that you can take down that doesn't need to be online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or that if you have a service window, a downtime window that you're allowed, you can just stop the database, do a MySQL dump, start it up again. I'm just kind of going through all of the major options for people who really just can't. It can never be down. We can never lose any data. These are your options. You can compress the InnoDB hot backup with control. You can compress it 1 to 9, where 1 is the fastest compression and 9 is the most compression. And as I was saying, there's an extra free tool to back up MyISOM so that your MyISOM tables are consistent with your InnoDB tables. And it actually doesn't use MySQL hot copy. It uses lock tables and an OS level copy. One of the interesting parts about the data files, again, you have compression. So the tables, the data backup is actually smaller than the actual data files. Obviously, if you copy using MySQL hot copy or an OS level copy of your data files, they're going to be exactly the same size. If you use MySQL dump, you actually get a bigger file because it's all text. Now, granted, you can compress it, and it compresses to really small. But if you're compressing, a 3 gig database, if you're MySQL dumping a 3 gig database, you're going to get more than 3 gigs because it's this huge text.
Actually, speaking of never going down, can I back up the replication for 1 second?
Sure.
Back up the slides.
Oh, okay.
Is it possible to set up a slave replication server without ever shutting down the master when you're initially configuring the data? You need the initial snapshot.
You need, well,
Shutting down the master.
the answer is yes and no. If you've thought about it ahead of time and you have the binary logs and you have the snapshot, if your regular backup is doing a snapshot, then yes. And I've actually done this in my company. I've set up 2 different replications at different points in time, 2 slaves, without having to shut down the master because it was already doing binary logging. It was already set up for master slave. It had the ID number. There's some settings that you need in your my.cnf. You have to give it an ID number. You have to make sure that it does the binary logs, things like that. And then your slave has a different ID number, and you give it the master info. But yeah, it can be done.
Yeah, we did it. We set up our replicating by doing an InnoDB hot backup, then restoring it, and then we set up the slave and we pointed it at the right binary log position and both it went.
Yep. So having all InnoDB tables or InnoDB and MyISOM and using the InnoDB hot backup, you have a snapshot, and so you can just use it. That's just for the folks watching from home. So let's see. This actually, I was very excited about this. I was so excited I actually put this slide up on Sherry.com a couple of days ago because I was very excited about it. I've never actually seen the information in this table put together like this. So if you're trying to decide what tool to use, there's actually, this table is set up so that that yeses are good and nos are bad. So that's why you get weird options like no locking up here, because you don't want to lock your, if you have to be online all the time, you don't want to lock your data. You want it available for writing as much as possible. DDL is does it back up their data definition language or create table statements. Snapshot is does it do a snapshot. Remote is can you use it remotely. I didn't actually talk about whether or not you can use it remotely, but if you have an important database over at an ISP and you don't have access to that server on the command line, there are certain tools you can't use. Down here you have is it free? You have does it work with all engines? Does it work with all tables? Can it easily dump all the tables? Back up all the tables. You can tell what I use. Does it easily back up all of the tables? So for instance, select into out file doesn't. You have to have external code to do that. Is it a text file, which makes it easier to see corruption? And can you recover from corruption? So you'll see in pretty much the columns, you'll see that it's 1 or 2 things have no's, and everything pretty much has like 4 or 5 no's. MySQL dump actually has the fewest number of no's. It's all yeses down here. It doesn't do the locking. It has an option to do it, but you don't really do it across tables. It has an option for the data definition language, but again, you have to be careful to make sure you get all of the options you want, none of the ones you don't. But it, and it doesn't, because it doesn't really do the locking well. It doesn't do a snapshot, but you can run it remotely. It's free. You can use it, with all engines, all tables. It makes a text file, and you can recover from corruption. Select into out file pretty much loses because you don't get the data definition language. Let's see, replication is pretty good. Replication also doesn't give you the data definition language. That's why you need a snapshot. It does give you the changes. So if you do an alter table, it will put that over, but if you need to get your schema, you're going to have to use something else. So it does do a snapshot. You can obviously use it remotely. It is free. It works with all engines. It will do all the tables in a database, or it will just do one